Hello, this is Jim Mustich at Iona University. I'm here today with Shannon Vallor, who is the fourth speaker in this year's Presidential Speaker Series at Iona. This evening she will be giving our Driscoll Lecture for the year on technology and the virtues. Shannon is an ethicist and philosopher of AI and the author of Technology and the Virtues and the AI Mirror: How to Reclaim Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking. She serves as director of the Center for Technomoral Futures in the Edinburgh Futures Institute and is program director for the Institute's Master of Science in Data and AI Ethics. Shannon, welcome to New Rochelle.
Thanks, James, for having me here.
Let's start with the backstory. How did you get to be doing what you do?
That's a really good question. It depends on how far back you want to go in the backstory.
Let's go all the way back, because I'm interested in how, how your affinity for the subject matter led you on the path that you followed.
Probably started with Star Wars. So, being 6 years old, seeing Star Wars in the theater, seeing the scale of the technology imagined, right? The giant destroyer coming overhead in the first scene. But then, of course, robots of various types and personalities, technologies that are used for both murderous authoritarian ends and for the defense of the vulnerable. There's a lot of themes of my work, actually, that show up in science fiction more broadly, but certainly as a kid, that was probably where my fascination with technology began. And I was just a giant nerd. I was really into computers. I was one of the first kids on my block whose parents, even though we, were in a working class neighborhood and my parents didn't have a lot of extra money and hadn't gone to university, they bought me one of the first personal computers instead of buying a new car, because they were sure that this technology was something that I would benefit from. And so I learned BASIC and programmed my own little adventure games from a very early age. I was obsessed with Atari and the console games, and so I was just a little nerd kid and loved science in school. And then I ended up taking a weird, odd path in my major, where I started out as a psychology major because I was really interested in cognition and consciousness and the brain and how it worked. But what I didn't quite realize is that I was in an institution where the psychology department didn't have much going on in terms of study of, the brain. And it was mostly about psychological theory and therapeutic approaches and things like that, which was somewhat less interesting to me. So I ended up being a little unmotivated for a while in college until I took a required philosophy course that was an ethics course. And I fell in love with that course, helped that the instructor was one of these philosophy instructors who just absolutely inspires students. He had a long list of students kind of following him around like a Pied Piper. But I changed my major within 3 weeks of starting that course to philosophy. And I was captivated by the ability to ask questions of an ethical nature and to treat those rigorously as things that were not matters of kind of subjective opinion, but things that you could construct logical and testable arguments about, that you could reason well or poorly about these things, and that you could be, in a sense, just as kind of technically challenged in philosophy as you could be in the hard sciences. So I pursued that path. I ended up studying in grad school the philosophy of science. I took a course on philosophy of technology, although at the time that wasn't a very common subject area for philosophy programs. But I got really interested in questions about how technology fed into the production of scientific knowledge. So when I came out of grad school, I was writing articles about things like particle accelerators and the extent to which they could be considered to generate observations of subatomic particles, or whether observation was not the right concept to apply to what you get, the kind of knowledge you get from working with particle accelerators. So I was really interested in the mediation of knowledge by technology. And then I started teaching philosophy. And I was teaching philosophy of science, but we had a course on the books called Science, Technology, and Society at Santa Clara University, where I was teaching in around 2005, 2006. And that course had a component that was about values and ethics in science and the way that science and technology shape society. So I taught that part by looking at smartphones and Facebook and things that were just starting to happen around that time. And my students responded with such almost desperate enthusiasm, because they were the first generation that was having their whole lives upended by these technologies. And it was placing so much emotional and psychological stress on them that they really needed to work through these things. And so when I saw how my students responded to that module, I ended up being inspired to start writing about the way that technology shapes us and shapes society. And that's been the story ever since. I've never looked back.
That's a wonderful personal history. Thank you. I'm struck by two things. One, Star Wars at the start, because I've often found over the years that when I've interviewed people, whether they be historians or authors of various stripes, their passion for their subject, for their vocation, or what became their vocation, always starts with an affinity that they didn't arrive at through some planned route.
Yeah.
That a historian will have read a biography of Marie Antoinette when she was 12, and all of the critical thinking and all of the things we value came long after that.
Yeah.
You know, Simon Schama, the wonderful historian, puts his affinity for history back to reading Kipling's Puck of Pook's Hill.
Yeah.
But then you said it when you were interested in the mediation of knowledge, and you were talking about the way you were drawn to the idea that you could think about ethics in as technically rigorous a way as you could about hard science. There's something about the feel for the subject that's also important.
Yeah.
And one of the things I often think about in terms of, as we think about AI, for instance, is will we lose the feel for those things that can motivate us because the knowledge is mediated in a different way?
Yeah, I worry about that too. On the one hand, I don't want to put all the blame on technology and AI for the changes in how students learn or what they choose to study, or the extent to which they can have that experience of fascination and captivation by something, which, as you say, is so important to falling in love with something enough that you can study it deeply for the rest of your life. That's hard work, right? And just like it's hard to love one person for your whole life, and it's possible and it's worth it, but boy, you need a lot of love to get through that, right? To study one thing for the rest of your life and to throw yourself into that takes a kind of love of the subject matter.
Yes.
And how do you make sure that students still have that experience when, as you say, increasingly our knowledge is mediated by our technologies, which may not allow us to experience it in that kind of raw and unprepared way that I came to my love of technology, or that other people come to their love of insects, right? Or that other people come to their the love of history, right? We all fall in love with different things and become fascinated by them. So how do we make sure that technology doesn't get in the way of that? because it's not just technology, it's also about the broader culture of education and the way that we talk about it and the way that we talk to students about the point of learning, right? There's been endless amounts written about how for the last 20 years, young people have been measured by various regimes of testing and ranking and benchmarking and told that every educational achievement is a means to an end, not an end in itself, right? You have to do well in this subject because that's how you get to the next thing, and you have to do well in that because that's how you get the next opportunity. And it's all this daisy chain of opportunities, but there's never a moment where you allow young people to just fall in love with something because they love it. So
Yes.
I think it's not just about the technology, but we have to make sure the technology doesn't make it even harder for students to genuinely fall in love with the world through education.
The subtitle of your latest book, the book is The AI Mirror, but the subtitle is How to Reclaim Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking. Now, it's notable to me that you say machine thinking rather than machine learning.
Yes.
And it's related a little bit to what you were just talking about, in that AI is not a phenomenon with no antecedents, no matter what Sam Altman may want us to believe. But really, it is a progression of a kind of mechanical view of thinking and of knowledge that has been in place for a very long time.
That's excellent.
And I think in your book you go into this, and it's one of the real insights of it, how much of the problems we might identify as being threats from AI are really of our own making and have been with us for quite some time, and they're just now more dramatically highlighted by the current emerging technology.
Yeah, that's right. The title has that little buried trick in it because it may make you think that I'm going to accept the proposition that machines today think, and that's what I'm talking about. But as you say, really, this mechanistic reduction of thinking to a set of efficiencies is something we've been doing for decades, long before AI was any more than a gleam in some computer scientist's eyes. And so I say in the book, when we talk about the problems that AI is causing or the threat that it poses to the future of human thinking or human agency and freedom, or the ability of the human imagination to create genuinely better and new futures. Whenever I talk about those things, I try to say, right, the call is coming from inside the house, right? AI is not a threat coming to us. It's not an alien intelligence that has landed on us and threatened us. It represents the way we've been thinking about our own minds for some time now. And it represents a crystallization in technology of a kind of anti-humanist way of approaching education, way of approaching social problems. And so if AI is a problem, that problem originates with us. And it originates with the way that we've allowed ourselves to lose sight of the richer possibilities of the human mind that go beyond the efficient optimization of computation.
Yeah. We often hear about the alignment problem, that we have to align technology with our values. But I think this is an instant where we're not really clear about what our values have been.
Yes.
Or what the values we've been promulgating, and that the issue with AI is not really an alignment problem. It is perhaps we can use it to actually identify how we've been unaligned with what we thought our values were or should be.
That's
I think
right.
a lot of your work explores that question.
Yeah, one of the challenges I give to those who present the problem with AI as an alignment problem where AI is out of alignment with human values, is to turn it on its head and say, actually, I think the problem is that AI is aligned with human values all too well. But not the values, as you say, that we go out and perhaps affirm in church on Sunday, or the values that we explicitly teach our children, or the values that we ourselves believe that we hold, right? But rather the values that we can see when we look at how we've chosen to structure our societies, what kinds of behaviors we've chosen to reward, what sort of experiences we've privileged. And when you look at the way we've actually lived our lives, the way we've actually structured our institutions, there's a huge gap between how those institutions actually function and are designed to function and the values that we profess to hold. Yes. AI is not aligned with the values we profess to hold. It's aligned with the values embedded in the structures we've built in society. And it's aligned very well with those. And so it's really about getting us to recognize the gap between the values that we aspire to and profess and the values that we've actually allowed ourselves to be driven by. And so there's an opportunity for AI to be, as I say, a mirror of a particularly instructive sort, where it can actually allow us to see that lack of perhaps a certain kind of honesty or integrity in our own lives and societies. If AI holds that mirror up and says, this is what humans do, because what AI does is reinforce and amplify all the strongest patterns found in the history of digitized human culture and decision making. So all the patterns that AI produces that are problematic are human patterns, human biases, human distortions, human value misalignments that we've allowed to dominate. So if AI is a problem, we have to look at it the way we would look in a mirror. And I say in the book, if you look in the mirror and you see dirt on your face, your first instinct should not be to smash the mirror, right? That's not going to be a constructive solution so that you just don't see the dirt anymore. The solution is to think about how you might remove the dirt from your face. So likewise, if AI shows us aspects of our values and the patterns of our decisions and the structures of our institutions that we don't like, that's an opportunity for us to then look and say, how can we reform ourselves and our institutions in such a way that we actually are embodying the values that we profess to care about?
So is it fair to say that there is a world in which we could use the AI or interact with AI in a manner that actually is contravenes the kind of mechanistic view of the mind or of education, fill in the blank, whatever you'd like. There's nothing inherent in our interaction with the technology that demands that we use it to rely on its output. We can actually use it more productively in a more of an impulse to inquiry.
Yes.
To actually ask questions rather than to give us answers.
And it's mixed. There are applications of AI where we probably do want to rely on its answers, because right. There are applications of AI that can solve problems that humans couldn't solve if you locked us in a room, for 100 years and said, you can't come out until you've solved the problem. We would just die in the room because we just don't have the cognitive resources to solve certain problems. So I think we need to make a distinction between the kinds of AI-driven solutions that are worth adopting. And of course, even those we need to be able to validate and make sure we have evidence that they're reliable. But there are certain kinds of decisions that we probably shouldn't be offloading to AI, even if AI can get better at making those decisions than we can. There are certain kinds of decisions that are essential that humans retain the ability to make. And so the book really wants to highlight that difference and to remind us of the importance of tracking that difference between the kinds of problems we should rely on AI as a tool, the way we rely on and have relied on calculators and many other kinds of instruments, right? We always rely on technologies. That's not inherently a problem. But we have to do so in a way that's wise. And one of the things that I talk about in the book at one point is the fact that the virtue of practical wisdom that the ancient Greeks talked about, phronesis, the kind of wisdom that allows you to solve problems in the real world, problems of a political and social nature in particular. That kind of wisdom got translated from the Greek phronesis into Roman language, and then eventually to the English word prudence. And when prudence is personified and depicted, let's say in Renaissance art, she's always depicted as holding a mirror. And I like to pick up that image because it's an indication of the way that wisdom is always something that can be amplified and extended by our tools. It's not that our tools are a threat to our wisdom. They are an extension of it, just as prudence holds out the mirror in front of her in order to possibly, there's many different ways of interpreting the depiction, possibly because the mirror gives her a view back into history and experience, her own experience, right? So we can think of, because it's sort of always pointed as if it's not just showing her face, but almost like it's showing what's behind her. So I really like the idea of thinking of AI as a mirror that can extend our wisdom if we choose to use it in this way. But I also point out that there are scenarios where a mirror is the wrong sort of tool to be relying on. So if you're climbing a mountain, the last thing you want to be doing as you're climbing that mountain is staring in a mirror pointing behind you.
Yes.
And AI tools are mirrors pointing behind us because all of the data that they are trained on are historical data. They tell us only about where we've been, not where we're going. And so thinking about AI tools as mirrors is a way of both seeing the possibilities that they have to augment our wisdom, but also the dangers of them becoming tools that we use in the wrong way and that actually get in the way of our ability to make our way up our own cognitive mountains and to travel to the kinds of places that AI tools haven't yet seen.
The distinction between prudence and intelligence is interesting.
Yeah.
I have, for a number of reasons, spent most of the past 12 months reading about AI developments and people's opinions about it. And as you are aware, there's lots of discussion lately about the imminence of AGI,
Right.
artificial general intelligence. But all discussions of that start with a disclaimer that we don't really know what intelligence is. We don't have a good definition of it. But the idea that machines can mimic human-level intelligence or possess human-level intelligence in itself has not been interrogated enough, because human-level intelligence, by any measure we have for intelligence, from IQ tests to grades to whatever you want to choose, is not always commensurate with lived experience. I mean, the people who score the highest on IQ tests don't necessarily navigate the world with the same kind of aplomb that somebody of lesser, in quotation marks, intelligence might have. We all know this.
Yes.
And so it struck me that there's an assumption from the people, the boosters of these systems, that they don't allow for the fact that human-level intelligence actually contains a great deal of stupidity.
Yeah.
And there's nothing, conceptually at least, inherent in the technology that assures that its version of human level intelligence might not only be possibly smarter than human beings, but also
stupider
dumber
at the same time.
Yes.
Yes.
So,
and we actually see this already. That is, we have AI tools that can outperform humans on certain benchmarks, but that will fail at problems that a 4-year-old can solve.
yeah.
So we already see this, right? The problem is something that you have to unpack at multiple levels. So first of all, there's the fact that Silicon Valley has long treated measurements as if they were the things measured, because they can be quantified, because they can be validated, right? But we know, for example, that the measurement of intelligence is not the quality of intelligence itself, and that there's a huge gap, as you say, between what we're trying to gesture to when we talk about intelligence and what our intelligence tests measure. And that's also by design, because there's a long history of intelligence testing that reveals the way in which intelligence tests were constructed specifically to be able to classify individuals in certain sorts of ways that would aid the project of eugenics, that would aid the project of white supremacy, for example. The idea was that you needed tests that would prove that Europeans had greater raw intelligence than non-Europeans, right? So we know that our tests are wildly inadequate to the biological phenomenon that is intelligence. But we also know the biological phenomenon is not a single scalar quantity. There is no single number that any biological organism can be adequately tagged with to measure its intelligence, because intelligence is a cluster of different capabilities that living things have. So the intelligence of a crab, or the intelligence of a blue whale, or the intelligence of a crow is extremely different from the intelligence of a human, and not simply in the sense of greater or lesser, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some animals have capabilities that humans lack. Now, it's true that because our brains are so complex, we have many more capabilities than most intelligent animals do, and we can combine them flexibly in ways that most animals can't. So intelligence is really not about a single quality, but actually about the sheer variety of forms of intelligence that humans have acquired and the ways that the brain links those together. So for example, the fact that we can use our ability to calculate sums and also use our emotional intelligence and then pair those to perform a task that requires both, that in itself is a form of intelligence that's more than the sum of its parts, right? And yet no intelligence test measures intelligence of the emotional kind and of the calculative kind at the same time. We don't have those kinds of measures. So we don't have a good understanding of what intelligence is because we use a single word for it, which misleads us into thinking that there's a single quantity or quality that we're naming, when in fact there's this just big, messy range of competencies that are all tied together. And then we devise tests to pick out some of those competencies over others, often for reasons that are politically or socially motivated or economically motivated.
Yes.
And then we mistake the measure for the thing. So there's just several levels of error that are built into the way we talk about intelligence. And unfortunately, Silicon Valley has, for the most part, adopted all of those errors uncritically.
Yeah.
There are exceptions. There are people in Silicon Valley who understand these things. But on the whole, the marketing engine of AI relies on these errors to work.
Yeah. I'm going to read you a quotation from a talk that was given in 1941, which seems prescient in retrospect, if you can be prescient in retrospect. In our age, when men seem more than ever prone to confuse wisdom with knowledge and knowledge with information, and to try to solve the problems of life in terms of engineering, there is coming into existence a new kind of provincialism, which perhaps deserves a different name. I mean also a distortion of values, the exclusion of some, the exaggeration of others, which stems not from lack of wide geographical perambulation, but from applying standards acquired within a limited area to the whole of human experience, which confounds the contingent with the essential, the ephemeral with the permanent. Now, that was a talk given in 1941 by T.S. Eliot to the Virgil Society. He was giving a talk about the Aeneid. Yeah. But it seems to me to be on the subject you were talking about, the way the cultural conversation around AI has been shaped by Silicon Valley and its marketing and economic imperatives, but also its kind of epistemic prejudices about measurement over the confusing measurement for the thing measured.
Yes.
Is that?
Absolutely. And Silicon Valley did not get created from nothing. It got created out of a culture that was shaped by people who had relatively similar educations, who'd gone to very similar English-speaking, largely, institutions in the West, and had inherited certain kinds of intellectual histories that were, in fact, quite impoverished, partly because of the 20th century splitting of the liberal arts and humanistic modes of education into a kind of fractured model of education where increasingly students are shuttled onto humane and literary subjects or onto STEM subjects, right, and then never allowed again to see how those things come from the same source, from the same world, right? And so you end up with people who are impoverished in one way or the other. You end up with philosophers who are impoverished because they don't understand the scientific and technical foundations of the world they're describing with their concepts, and you have engineers and computer scientists whose understanding of the world is impoverished because they don't understand the social, political, and value-driven foundations of the knowledge that they are working with, and the limitations and gaps and flawed assumptions that it's built on. So this then leads to a world where people look through a lens that shows them a world that looks complete, dangerously complete. And I've seen that on both sides, but certainly in kind of the Silicon Valley world, where we've created a kind of self-reinforcing model of the world that insists that everything can be reduced to efficiencies, everything can be reduced to problems that have a single quantifiable optimal solution, and that anything that doesn't fit that model must not be real or must not be of true value. And so fighting that and trying to reintroduce these complexities, because those complexities are the world, back into the world of computing, I think is the big challenge of the next 100 years. And I think if we don't do it, if we don't reintegrate the culture of technology with sort of humane cultures of lived human experience, I don't think we'll make it. The good news is there's nothing stopping us from that reintegration, from recognizing it. And I founded the Center for Techno-Moral Futures in Edinburgh. That word techno-moral, which is a mouthful and very awkward, is precisely to reflect the need to reintegrate these two threads that have been artificially split from one another. Yeah. And one of the things I often point out is that the heart of technology is not, in fact, divorced from our moral lives. We build technologies to allow us to embed our values more stably into the world and into our relationships and into our surroundings. Technology has always been value-driven. It's always about what we care about and what we want to preserve and what we want to build and what we want to enable. So technology and morality, and technology and the values that we have, whether they're aesthetic or political or economic, those have always been part of a whole. We've just artificially separated them. But we won't be able to solve the big problems of the next 100 years for humanity unless we can reweave those threads together.
Beautifully said. I want to go back to something you said earlier about how technology, while we think of it as futuristic, is certainly in the case of AI really looking backward.
Yeah.
And one of the dangers of its power and the power of the people trying to promulgate it widely in culture and commerce, politics, everywhere else, is that it's twofold. One is it can, because of the privileging of measurement and of the mechanistic way of thinking, it can actually redefine what knowledge is, because
Yes.
it becomes the authority.
Yep.
So that's one problem. The second is, because it is, as you say, based upon looking back, it threatens to put humanity into a kind of mental and moral conservatorship.
Yeah.
And do you see that as a threat?
I see that as the biggest threat at the moment, actually. I mean, and they're paired together. So I often talk about the threat of moral and cognitive de-skilling from these particular forms of automation that don't think about how to use these technologies to actually strengthen our cognitive and moral muscles, but rather allow them to degrade from lack of use, or to become rigid because they're used only in a very narrow way.
Mm-hmm.
That risk of de-skilling, though, I think is very much linked to the inability to craft new forms of society and envision solutions to problems that don't follow a pattern we've already seen. And what AI tools do is take the dominant patterns of the past and apply them even more efficiently than humans can to the problems of the future that are facing us. Which, as you say, I love that phrase of conservatorship, because it includes the root of the word conservative, right? Conserving, keeping things more or less the same. But a conservatorship is also something that takes over our agency, keeps it lives our lives for us rather than allowing us to make what might be suboptimal choices, right? But suboptimal choices are part of the domain of freedom. And so I think about this sometimes when, particularly as a woman, it's a striking thought, because if we had the kind of AI that we have today, and people were, if we'd had that 120 years ago, and people were using those technologies to make policy, to define the goals of society, to set the targets for the justice system, to measure social progress. If we'd had these technologies today, at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, women would never have been able to vote. Because the pattern by which you could simply introduce this new power of the political franchise to the half of humanity that historically had been denied it in almost all parts of the world. To break that pattern, an AI system would never break that pattern. The pattern of patriarchy was far too strong.
Mm-hmm.
The only people who could break that pattern were people who could envision a society that didn't look like the past, that wasn't a continuation of what had always been seen to be optimal, but that could be radically new. And this is, of course, true not just for women's suffrage. It's true when we think about new forms of art, like non-representational art. It's true when we think about civil rights and human rights. It's true when we think about the idea of becoming aware of moral responsibilities to non-living things like the planet.
Mm-hmm.
These were all ideas that radically broke with the patterns of the recent past. And that's exactly what AI tools today don't do. They don't invent brand new roads we've never traveled. They give us statistically plausible variations of the roads we're already on and have long been on. And we're at a moment where we know that our current economic order is unsustainable. It can't keep going the way it's going. You can't keep driving inequality to these extremes without the fabric of society breaking down. It's environmentally and resource-wise unsustainable. We know we cannot keep consuming fossil fuels at the rate that we are. We know that we can't keep polluting the oceans with plastic at the rate that we are. I could go on, right? But we are not in a moment where conservatism is going to work for the human family. And here I'm not talking about political conservatism specifically. I'm talking in a much broader sense. The conservatism of simply extending the patterns of society that we have been allowing to dominate for the past couple of centuries. We know that we're heading off a cliff. And when you're heading off a cliff, you need the power to turn the wheel.
Mm-hmm.
And AI is essentially a form of decisional autopilot that basically sets the trajectory that you're on and ensures that you get there as quickly and efficiently as possible. But if there is the cliff edge, the last thing you want to do is turn your society over to AI or turn your own thinking over to AI, right? That's exactly the worst moment to do that, is when you're racing towards an unsustainable cliff edge, whether that's in economics or the environmental picture. So I'm really interested in thinking about how could AI become something that, at best, helps us turn the wheel, increases our sense of agency, increases our sense of capability, allows us to determine what directions to turn the wheel in more wisely,
And
as opposed to a technology that makes us more passive and inclined to simply be passengers going along for the ride.
And that choice is, in the most optimistic scenario at least, it's up to us. We can use the technology for the former rather than the latter, of increasing our survivability or our freedoms, as opposed to signing on for autopilot.
In the abstract, yes.
Yes.
But in practical terms, it doesn't quite work that way. And that's because there is no we, right? There are many we's. And some we's have more power than other we's. And so there's this sort of abstract sense of humanity has a choice, absolutely. There's nothing that is metaphysically preventing us from using AI to enhance human agency. But in practice, there are a lot of very powerful, wealthy we's who do not want us to do that, because that will change a social system that is currently working out very well for them.
But there's nothing inherent in the technology that demands we use it in that way. It's actually the product of social forces or economic forces that are kind of channeling the technology in a direction that insists upon that kind of control and optimization and efficiency.
Yes. And I think it's important at this point to distinguish between two uses of the words AI. We could use AI to mean a family of technologies, including versions of AI that we're not currently building, but that we could build,
right,
that are in reach, right? So there's a concept of AI in which what you say is true, that this particular disempowering, de-skilling aspect of AI is not intrinsic to the idea of AI or even to the kinds of possibilities of AI that we have in front of us right now. On the other hand, the kinds of AI that are being marketed and sold to us are already invested with certain affordances, already invested with certain biases, with certain capabilities that make it very difficult for those tools to be repurposed to humane and wise ends. So we have to be open to the idea that in order for us to use AI wisely, we're probably going to need forms of AI that we don't have today. But we absolutely can demand those, and those are absolutely within reach. Some of the Silicon Valley marketing narrative is heavily invested in making you think that the kind of AI that we have today was somehow the only kind of AI we could have had.
Right.
And that there are no other possibilities on the table, so you just have to adapt to the form of AI that you get. That is a very dangerous lie, because there are many possible ways of developing AI for certain kinds of values and certain kinds of ends. And it's very possible to take the kinds of AI that we have today and design them slightly differently in order to achieve different kinds of goals than the AI companies currently want to pursue. But that requires political agency on our part. It requires people to say, technology isn't just whatever we get from Silicon Valley. Technology has to be answerable to us. That meaning the people who make technology have to be answerable to us. They have to be answerable to us in the sense that if we say this technology is destroying our institutions, if it's destroying the integrity of our media landscape, which is one of the pillars of our democracy, it's not adequate to just say, well, I guess that's what technology does.
Mm-hmm.
No. I mean, we've seen how that kind of passivity has worked out in terms of, the present situation geopolitically. Social media has not been something that has been good for democracy, by and large. And that's because we didn't demand that it be measured by its impact on democratic health. We simply accepted that if we wanted social media technology, we had to have a damaged, disabled media ecosystem with it. No, we didn't have to accept that. And we shouldn't accept damaging forms of AI for the same reason.
I want to read a quote from the AI Mirror as we get towards our conclusion here. You're writing about the Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset,
Mm-hmm.
and you say, and this will redeem me perhaps in the eyes of any of my engineer friends who heard the earlier part about engineering. He insisted that the most basic impulse of the human personality is to be an engineer, carrying out a lifelong task of auto-fabrication, literally the task of making ourselves. The task is ours because nature cannot provide the complete blueprint. We must draft it ourselves. Human language and culture, born of our surplus cognitive energy and capacity, liberated us from animal compulsions and desires without separating us from them. So this idea of making ourselves or drafting our future or our disposition towards the world is a view of a life that is under threat, because it presupposes an inner life that's can go toe-to-toe with lots of external forces. And it also suggests that there is no end point to being human.
Yes.
Whereas lots of the models we have, to go back to where we started with the mechanistic view of the world and of life and of the mind, kind of presupposes that we're getting to some place before death, which certainly is the end point for all of us, that there's some kind of productivity goal that this is enhancing, which seems to be a fundamentally skewed view of what human experience is.
Yes. There's a magazine piece I wrote for a magazine called Noema called The Danger of Superhuman AI Is Not What You Think. And in that piece I talk about the impoverished concept of a human life as an exercise in efficient optimization. And I give the example of playing with your child. If you think the goal of your child's play and your engagement with the child is to achieve the goal of that activity as efficiently and quickly as possible, you have completely misunderstood what play is. And you've completely misunderstood the value of play, both in a child's formation, but also in an adult human life.
Yes.
Play is an exercise of human agency. It's an ability to say, what if I change the rules? What if I break the rules? Because there are very rigid forms of play where the rules of the game limit what you can do. But children play in a way that both tries to sense out where those boundaries are, but also to see what happens when you cross them. What happens when I change the rules? What happens when I change the pattern in this way? It's experimentation, it's open-endedness. And play doesn't have a natural conclusion where you say, I've done it, I've done the thing. I'm done with play now, right? Play is this natural, open-ended state of being that is so central to the value of a human life that I can't overstate it, right? And yet it's completely incomprehensible on the model of efficient computation. And yet you have people who will want to say that intelligence is simply the reduction of all activity to this kind of efficiency model. So it's stripping away things like play, which are not just enjoyable. They're not just part of what makes life worth living. They're also fundamental to intelligence. And in fact, one of the things you see that cuts across humans and other species is that very intelligent creatures tend to also be playful. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And play is how intelligence is built. So I think we absolutely have to understand that intelligence must not be allowed to be conceived on this model of mindless optimization and efficiency. That not only misses what's good about life, and life is not all about intelligence. There are things about life that are wonderful no matter how intelligent you are by any measure, right?
Yes.
But also, even intelligence suffers when we reduce it to this mechanistic frame. And I think there's a form of AI waiting out there that could be part of a world where intelligence is rehabilitated in its richer sense, and AI becomes a new extension of human intelligence into the world that we can share, that we can play with. And that's the world I think we need to fight for.
I think what you say about intelligence and play is extremely relevant to the context here at Iona as we wrap this up, because much of what you're saying applies to education as well. We've reduced education to being a search for efficiency or predictability or controllability.
Yep.
That you can control your future because of your education. Whereas I think in the most expansive and most resourceful, most resilient definition of education, it allows you to better pursue that lifelong task of auto-fabrication that Ortega-y-Gasset talks about.
That's right.
Yeah.
And by gaining the capacity to creatively make and remake ourselves, we also gain and preserve the capacity to creatively make and remake our societies.
Yes.
And giving that up just isn't an option as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. This is inspiring and a perfect conclusion.
Thanks for having me here, and thanks for a great conversation.
Yeah, likewise.